Two young men, full of life and promise, descended into Ellison's cave on what was supposed to be a daring adventure. Instead, it became a frozen grave. What started as a simple mistake, a dropped backpack, unraveled into a tragedy that left them tangled in their own ropes, trapped in the icy cave's grip, and fighting for survival. This is the story of how a moment of misjudgment turned fatal in one of America's deepest caves. On February 12, 2011, a group of 10 students from the University of Florida embarked on a journey that they hoped would be a thrilling adventure. Among them were 5 boys and 5 girls, all young and full of life, eager to explore the depths of Ellison's Cave, a notorious site tucked away in Walker County on Pigeon Mountain, Georgia. They had traveled over 400 miles to get there, driven by their collective curiosity and the thrill of exploring one of the deepest caves in the United States. Leading the expedition was 20-year-old Grant Lackenbach, who had planned the trip to celebrate his upcoming birthday the following week. He was the glue of the group, a natural leader with a calm, reassuring presence. Alongside him was his close friend Michael Pye, both of whom shared more than just academic ambitions. They were deeply connected by their Christian faith, spending many late nights in deep discussion about life, their studies, and the world beyond. The two of them had a bit more experience than most in the group when it came to caving. Grant had explored caves before, and so had Michael, although Ellison's cave was unlike anything they'd encountered. The group dynamic was friendly and tight-knit, united by a shared love for nature and a sense of camaraderie that had blossomed over the course of their studies. The boys and girls joked and laughed as they prepared their gear, unaware that within hours, some of them would be pushed to their physical and mental limits in ways they could never have anticipated. They had gear, helmets, harnesses, ropes, and lights, and more importantly, they had each other. What they didn't have was a guide. This was a self-led expedition, organized entirely by the students themselves. Grant had done his research. He had maps, he had the logistics figured out, but when it came to navigating a cave like Ellison's, experience wasn't just a luxury, it was essential. As the group entered the cave, there was no way of knowing that this would be the day that their camaraderie would be put to the ultimate test. The cave stretched before them, dark and vast. The walls seemed to close in as they moved deeper, the air growing colder with each step. As they ventured deeper into Ellison's cave, the true nature of its environment began to reveal itself. The students were initially too focused on the excitement to notice the subtle changes around them, but as the narrow passageways twisted and turned, and the light from the cave's mouth faded behind them, it became clear that they had underestimated what they were walking into. Ellison's Cave is a monster. At over 1,000 feet deep, it ranks as the 12th deepest cave in America. A fact that, on paper, may have sounded thrilling to students, but inside, it became all too real. The walls of the cave were cold to the touch. The further they descended, the more the temperature dropped. The cave averaged around 56 degrees Fahrenheit in the summer, but this was winter, and the cold was settling in with a bite none of them were prepared for. They were inching towards the warm-up pit, an ominously named 125-foot drop that featured a waterfall cascading down into the dark abyss. It was a breathtaking sight, but not one to be taken lightly. The pit, while not as infamous as the nearby Fantastic Pit, the deepest unobstructed pit in the US, at a staggering 586 feet, was a sharp reminder of how treacherous this environment could be. This wasn't just a hole in the ground. It was a descent into a world where one mistake could mean life or death, and mistakes had already been made. Despite Grant and Michael's prior caving experience, the group was far from properly prepared. They had packed for an adventure, but not for the brutal cold and damp conditions Ellison's cave presented. The students were wearing casual clothing, shorts and t-shirts that would have been fine for a hike on a warm Florida afternoon. But in a cave, it was a different story. The temperature inside was unforgiving, especially in winter. Dampness clung to their clothes, and it wasn't long before the cold began to creep into their bones, slowing their movements and clouding their judgment. To make matters worse, they had left their phones in the vehicles parked outside. This was a decision made to avoid the risk of losing them in the cave, but it only meant they had no way to call for help if things went wrong. In their excitement and eagerness to explore, they hadn't fully accounted for how quickly conditions could turn against them. Their clothing, soaked from the cave's condensation and the mist from the waterfall, became a significant problem. Without proper cold weather gear, the group began to experience the early signs of hypothermia. Shivering became uncontrollable. Their movements were slower, and decision-making became muddled. The cold wasn't just uncomfortable, it was dangerous. And as they reached the mouth of the warm-up pit, staring down into the inky darkness below, it was clear that things were only going to get more difficult from here. The mood inside Ellison's cave had already shifted when the incident occurred. The initial excitement that had fueled the group through the winding passages was slowly giving way to the cold reality of the cave's unforgiving environment. But the tipping point came suddenly and without warning. It started with a simple mistake. One of the students, fumbling with their gear as they prepared to descend further, lost grip on their backpack. It tumbled down into the warm-up pit, the 125-foot drop with a waterfall thundering into the dark void below. The sound of the backpack disappearing into the pit, swallowed by the roar of water, was met with a brief silence among the group. The pit was already daunting, but the thought of retrieving the bag from its depths seemed like a challenge too risky for the conditions they were in. But Grant Lackenbach, ever the leader, saw it differently. The bag wasn't just filled with snacks or extra clothing. It contained some crucial gear that they might need later. Despite his friend's protests, Grant decided he was going to get it back. His decision, a mix of responsibility and maybe a bit of pride, led him to volunteer without hesitation. Using the ropes they had brought, Grant began to rappel down into the pit. His friends stood above, tense but trusting that he knew what he was doing. After all, Grant was the most experienced among them. As he descended, the roar of the waterfall grew louder, echoing off the walls of the cave, drowning out their calls of caution. The temperature plummeted as he moved further into the heart of the pit, the icy spray from the waterfall soaking him within minutes. Then, the first sign of trouble. The rope, slick with water and weighed down by the force of the waterfall, began to shift awkwardly. It caught on the jagged rocks, tangling itself as Grant struggled to maneuver. The spray from the waterfall was relentless, pounding against him as he tried to free himself. But the cold was like nothing he'd ever felt. The icy water soaked through his clothes, stealing the warmth from his body with every second. His movements slowed. He became disoriented, his mind fogged by the creeping hypothermia. The group above could still hear him, his voice muffled by the roar of the water, but it was clear that something was wrong. Grant's usually calm and authoritative tone had changed. Now it was laced with confusion and incoherence. His hands fumbled with the rope, but he couldn't get free. The waterfall had trapped him. Realizing that Grant was in trouble, Michael Pye knew that he couldn't stand by. He was Grant's closest friend, his Christian brother, and in that moment, his only thought was to help. Without wasting time, Michael volunteered to go after him. The group hesitated. 2 people in danger would only make things worse, but Michael insisted. He descended into the pit, using the same rope, hoping to reach Grant before things got worse. But as soon as Michael entered the pit, the cold struck him, too. The waterfall was relentless, battering him as he fought to reach his friend. He called out to Grant, but his voice barely carried over the noise. As Michael got closer, he saw Grant struggling, entangled in the ropes, barely able to move. Michael tried to help, but the water made everything slippery and unstable. In the chaos, he too became trapped in the tangle of ropes. The waterfall soaked him to the bone, and the cold began to take over his body just as it had Grant's. Minutes felt like hours. The group above could hear their voices fading, growing weaker until they were barely audible over the constant roar of the waterfall. Panic set in. They had no phones and no way to call for help immediately. They were stranded, two friends trapped in the freezing grip of the cave, and time was running out. Finally, at 2:19 p.m., someone managed to reach a phone and make an emergency call. By the time the emergency rescuers arrived, it was too late. Within 30 minutes of being trapped, both Grant and Michael's voices had gone silent. By 3:30 p.m., rescuers reached them, but the cave had claimed its victims. Both Grant and Michael were found without pulses, their bodies cold and lifeless, still entangled in the ropes that had sealed their fate. The rescue operation that followed the tragedy was swift, yet painstakingly slow. Walker County's cave and cliff rescue team responded to the emergency call, arriving at Ellison's cave with the heavy knowledge that this was not going to be a typical rescue. Conditions inside the cave were already dire, and the clock was ticking against them. The team split into two groups. Some of the rescuers turned their attention to the surviving students. Despite their panic and shock, most of the group had started showing signs of hypothermia. They were cold, wet, and shivering uncontrollably, their casual clothing doing little to protect them from the cave's bitter chill. The rescue team treated the students with warmth packs, blankets, and whatever limited supplies they had to stave off the advancing effects of the cold. In those moments, the rescuers knew that these students had narrowly escaped the same fate as Grant and Michael. While some team members were working to ensure the survivors would make it through the night, the second group of rescuers focused on the grim task of retrieving Grant and Michael's bodies from the pit. The rope that had once been their lifeline was now a tangled web of despair, slick with water and twisted tightly around the two young men. It would take 6 long, grueling hours to free their lifeless bodies from the unforgiving grasp of the rope and the narrow walls of the pit. By the time the operation concluded and Grant and Michael were finally brought to the surface, it was nearly 10 p.m. The cave had claimed them, leaving behind only the haunting silence that now filled the void where their voices had once echoed. In the days that followed, the tragedy sent shockwaves through the University of Florida community and beyond. These two young men, once full of life, were now remembered not only for how they died, but for the lives they had lived. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe to the channel to see more videos like this.